Okay, so welcome back. Now this is part 2 in our playlist, our series, where we're talking about computer databases. And in part 1, we showed you how to create from scratch a SQL database. In this video, we're going to take that database that we created and we're going to develop this very simple application you see here. And this application will take that database and it will map some of the tables that we created in that database, and it will show them here in what we call data grid views. We're in C# Visual Studio Windows Forms. You can use whatever IDE and whatever computer programming language you want. The same concepts apply. But what we've done is we've got two data grid views and we're mapping two tables from our database. And to step back and see where we left off last time, what we did to create this database, we used a very simple way to create a database, and that is to use a spreadsheet. And here we've got a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. You can use something like LibreOffice Calc, which is a free spreadsheet application. And what we did is we used this Excel spreadsheet because it's so easy to input data into a spreadsheet. And also the spreadsheet is very similar to a database. And in fact, in this spreadsheet, we've got what you see here, which is one table, and we can select multiple tables. We can generate multiple tables called worksheets in the spreadsheet. Basically takes these worksheets and converts them into tables like you see here in the database. And you can look at this buses worksheet and it maps exactly to the buses table in our database. The data is exactly the same. So we took that spreadsheet, converted it to a database, and brought it into this application. And the reason why we're using these what's called data grid views is because you can get a really good view on whether it's all working, what you're importing into your application. You can actually see the data compared to the spreadsheet that you generated and make sure everything is coming in okay. So now another thing we talked about in the previous video is this piece of free software that we used that will create the database from this Excel spreadsheet. And it's really nice because you can create the database. You just import the spreadsheet into here, you create the database, and you can go through and you can browse the data, you can make changes, you can run SQL queries on it. So really wonderful piece of software. I encourage you to take a look at that. So now what we're going to do in this video is we're going to say, okay, now that we've got the database created, the database file, what we're going to do is we're going to figure out how we can bring that into our C# application and access the data. Not only read it and display it, but also change the data and do SQL queries, operate on it as you would with any database. So now let's first take a look at some key concepts we're going to have to be aware of before we start writing code for our C# Visual Studio Windows Forms application to access this database. So when we use DB browser, we created a database file, a .db file, and it is located in the installation directory for this DB browser application. And you can see here we're in C, Program Files, DB browser for SQLite. And the first thing here is the database that we generated from our Excel spreadsheet. And I named it PowerSystemEquipment.db because it is representing some real-world equipment. What we're going to do is we're going to take that .db file and move it to our C# Visual Studio Windows Forms solution. And we're going to have to do a couple configuring things on that database file that we'll talk about. But keep that in mind. We're going to bring it into our solution and then tweak it a little bit to get it to work the way we want. Then what we have to do is, in order to have our application connect and work with that database, we have to set up what's called a connection string. And that basically defines some parameters about what's the name of the file and so on. So we're going to have to modify what's called the app.config file in our solution to make sure that it knows what that connection string is so it can talk to the database. Now, previously in this channel, we've talked a lot about CSV files, which are used a lot in the business science engineering world. And what we did is when we're writing our code, sometimes we came upon the need to have CSV files that look kind of like this. There's different types of CSV files. There's, for example, in the engineering world, you see a lot of CSV files where each line represents for example, a reading from a data acquisition device. However, other times you need something like this where each line represents, in this case, a real-world piece of equipment. And what we want to do in this case, where we have objects being represented by the CSV file, we'd like to have a way to very quickly take this one line and map it to a class or an object in our code and fill in automatically the parameters of that object, and then we can read all these in automatically. And what we did with CSV files is we used an application called CSV Helper that made that very easily. It basically just read a line of the CSV file, mapped it to a class object, filled in the parameters automatically, and then you had a list of objects which are very easy to work with. So what we'd like to do, since we have a database that looks, basically it represents this also, but instead of CSV, it's in a SQL database, we'd also like to have some way to interact with our database in the same way that we have CSV Helper. So we'd like to have some database application that will map each line of the database in the tables to classes in our code. So there is a really nice application on GitHub called Dapper. It's extremely popular. And it's very like CSV Helper, but instead of CSVs, it works on SQL databases. So we're going to use Dapper, which means we're going to have to download and install that. So that's one thing we're going to have to keep in mind when we set this all up. So we're going to have to go to GitHub for Dapper, but also SQL. We're going to use SQLite, which is a free SQL version, and we're going to have to install system.data.sqlite.core. So that we have to keep that in mind when we're setting this up. So we got to move the database, we've got to set the properties of the database, we have to modify the app.config, and then we're going to install a couple of GitHub source codes. And then of course we're going to have to create classes and lists of classes to read those objects. Using Dapper, it's going to map them into these classes, these objects. And then we're going to have to add a reference to system.configuration. But basically, those are the things we're going to have to do in order to get this all set up. So let's start taking a look at our code and see how we can set this up. So here is our application. Again, it's a C# Visual Studio Windows Forms application. And it's going to be very, very simple to set up. Here we've got our Form 1. And all I've done is I've drag and dropped two data grid view controls. So you go down, Toolbox, Data Grid View. So I've got two of them. One is going to represent one table and the other is going to represent another table. And I've also added two classes. So we're basically making a line class which represents this table. And then we're going to have a bus class which represents the bus table. And for now, we're just going to leave it at those two. We've got more tables in our database, but we're just going to use those. And we're just going to map the names that are in the database with these classes. And here is our basic Form 1. And you can see there's not much to it. We got three methods, and we've got an event handler for the exit button. So first, we're going to have to move that powersystmequipment.db into our solution. And all we have to do is go to that location of the open folder in File Explorer and just copy and paste that powersystmequipment.db that we generated in here. You may have to select Include from Project. It's already included, but you may have to select Include from Project. And then we have to do is we have to select that DB file and go down to properties. You can see there are two things we have to set up. As we said before, the build action has to be content, and copy to output directory has to be copy if newer. And that's just going to set up the database, so if we make any changes in this application, it's going to update them. And that's about it for the database. We're also going to have to select the project and go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, Manage NuGet Packages for Solution, and we're going to have to search for these two. One is Dapper, and one is system.data.sqlite.core. And install both of those into our application, and we should be all set to go. Now, one other thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to go to References, Add Reference, and scroll down to System.configuration and make sure that's checked. We're going to need that. So now, as we mentioned before, we have to set up the connection string. So we're going to go over here to app.config, and we're going to add these 3 lines of code. We're going to add connection strings and then / connection strings to end that. And just add this, add name equals default, and then connection string equals, and we specify the data source, which is our power system equipment.db. And we're going, since it's located in our solution, we can do the dot backslash to say in this present solution. And then we have to add to it our semicolon version 3, and then provider name is system.data.sql client. And that will be it to specify the connection string. That basically says, hey, we need to connect with this database at this location, version 3 and SQL client, and that's going to allow us to connect with the database. So now that we've got everything configured, we can start to set up our code to talk to the database. So first, the using statements. Of course, we're using Dapper. System collections.generic, since we're going to have lists of objects. System configuration that we just talked about. System.data to SQLite, system.link, and then systemwindows.forms. And that's all the using statements. Here we've got our main form. And as we said before, we have to configure 2 lists. In our case, we're only going to use 2. We have actually 4 tables in our database, but we're going to access 2 right now. And it's going to be list of bus. Again, we've got the bus class and we've got the line class. So we're going to have a list of bus, we're going to call it buses, and a list of line called lines. And we're going to populate those based on what's in the database. So we've got our initialize component to start out. And here what we're going to do is we're going to define a query that a SQL query that we can send in to say, hey, get all of the data from the buses table and give that back to us, and we will populate this list of bus objects. And that's the thing that Dapper is going to do. It's going to automatically take that data and populate the list of buses. So we're going to define our bus query as select all from the buses table. And then we're going to call a method that we're going to develop called getBusData, and we're going to feed it this query. And it's going to return the list of buses. We're going to do exactly the same for the lines. We're going to call it line query, select from lines, and it's going to return this list of line objects, and we're going to call getLineData using that line query. Basically, they're identical. You can use generics, but we're just going to do this very simple right now. And then once we've got this list of buses and list of lines, we're going to access the data grid view and dump that list of buses and list of lines into those data grid views. And it's really, really easy. All you have to say is data grid view 1.data source is that list of buses. Same thing for the list of lines. So the code is really, really simple. The data grid view is wonderful because you can just give it a list of objects and it will spit those into the data grid view. So now all we have to do is we have to define the getBusData, getLineData, and also another method called loadConnectionString. So we set out this in the app.config, we define the connection string, but we're going to have to load it. So let's first look at the getBusData. So again, we feed it the string, the query string, and it's returning a list of buses. And we're going to do a using statement, which means that only between these brackets is this connection going to be open. So we're going to do IDB connection, and we're going to call it connection string, is a new SQLite connection. And we're going to call load connection string, which is going to grab the connection string, and we'll see that in a bit. It's going to grab it from the app.config, and it's going to start a connection, And here we're going to do connection string.query, and we're going to feed it the bus table. So we're querying the bus table, and we're going to feed it the query string we want to apply and new dynamic parameters. And that's going to return a output, which is an IEnumerable of all of the data in the bus table. Now, we don't want it as an IEnumerable, we want it as a list, so what we have to do is output.toList and return that, and now we've got, based on this input string, we've got the output list of buses, so all of that data is being returned. And this is kind of a standard format. We're going to use the exact same thing in the getLine data. We're going to return a list of getLine data, and we've got the query string. This is the select star from lines. And again, using IDB connection string is new SQLite connection, load connection string. And the output IEnumerable is going to be connection string.query line table. And we're going to do the line query string, new dynamic parameters. And it's going to return that IEnumerable of all the line data and convert it to a list and return it. So the only thing left is to show how we do this load connection string. And really it's very simple. We're going to pass it a default, and recall when we did the app.config, we named it default. So we're going to pass it that default. You can choose another one if you want. And then we're going to turn configuration manager.connection strings ID, which is the default, .connection string. So it's going to return that connection string so that whoever wants it can set up a connection with the database. And that's about it. The only other thing is our application exit. But at this point, we now have two methods to connect to the database, grab the data, and then close the connection. And once we got that, we just put it into the data grid view, and we've got the resulting application. Now again, all this does is it grabs the data and puts it into data grid view. In next video, what we're going to do is we're going to see how to access the data, how to do SQL queries, and that kind of thing. So if you're liking these videos, I encourage you to hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell notifications, but most of all, please let others know that we're here so we get some views. Really appreciate it. Otherwise, take care. Have a really good day. Thanks.